The evening air was cold, and the streetlights glowed dimly against the fog that wrapped around the city. People walked quickly, their coats pulled tight, their shoes tapping against the wet pavement. In the middle of that busy street, a young girl walked slowly, her steps heavy from hunger and exhaustion. Her clothes were thin and old, and her shoes had small holes that let the chill bite through. In her hands she held a small torn bag that seemed to carry everything she owned. She looked at the bright lights of a grand cafe on the corner. Inside, people were laughing, eating, and enjoying the warm glow that spilled out onto the street. The smell of freshly baked bread and coffee drifted through the open door each time someone entered or left. She stood outside for a long moment, staring through the window. Her stomach growled, but it wasn't just hunger that made her stop. In the corner of the cafe, near the stage, stood a shiny black piano. Her eyes softened as she saw it. The polished surface reflected the chandelier lights, and the sight of it made her heart ache. It had been so long since she'd touched a piano. She used to play every day when life was different, when she still had a home, when her mother's voice filled the small apartment, humming along as she practiced. Those memories felt distant now, like echoes from another life. The girl took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe hit her instantly, along with the murmur of conversation and clinking of glasses. No one noticed her at first. She looked out of place among the neatly dressed customers. Her hair was messy from the wind, and her hands were red from the cold. She walked slowly toward the piano, but before she could get close, a man in a vest, the cafe manager, stopped her. "Excuse me, miss," he said sharply, eyeing her from head to toe. "Can I help you?" She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wondering if I could play the piano for a few minutes." "Just one song," the man frowned. "This isn't a street corner, young lady. That piano isn't for anyone to touch." She hesitated, her stomach twisting. "I don't want money," she said quietly. I haven't eaten all day. If I play well, maybe I could have a meal. Just something small." Her words hung in the air, awkward and out of place in a room filled with comfort. A few customers nearby overheard and began to whisper. Someone laughed softly, and another said under their breath, "A meal for a song? That's a new one." The manager crossed his arms. "We're running a business, not a charity," he said coldly. "You can't just walk in here asking to trade piano music for food." The girl's eyes dropped to the floor. She turned slightly toward the door, ready to leave, but before she could, an older waiter came from behind the counter. His white hair and kind eyes stood out in the busy cafe. "Let her play," he said gently. "Just one song. It won't hurt anyone." The manager sighed, looking annoyed. "And if she ruins the mood?" "She won't," the waiter replied. "Something tells me she won't." There was a short silence. The people in the cafe turned their eyes toward the girl, curious now. The manager finally shrugged. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "One song. But if you cause any trouble, you'll have to leave immediately." The girl nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. She walked slowly to the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long moment before she touched them. They felt smooth and cold under her fingertips. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost unsure. But as her hands moved, something changed. The sound that filled the cafe wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the kind of music played in background to fill silence. It was alive. It told a story. The melody rose and fell like waves, gentle yet powerful. Every note seemed to carry emotion, pain, longing, and something pure like hope. The laughter stopped. The clinking of cups faded. The room fell completely still. People turned in their seats, eyes fixed on her. Even the professional pianist who usually played during dinner stood frozen near the bar, his mouth slightly open. The girl didn't look up once. Her whole body moved with the rhythm, her fingers flowing effortlessly across the keys. It was clear this was no random song. This was something personal, something she carried deep inside her. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading into silence. No one moved. Then slowly, as if waking from a dream, people began to clap. At first it was gentle, then stronger. Some even stood up. The manager looked stunned. The same customers who had laughed earlier now stared at the girl with disbelief and respect. One woman wiped a tear from her eye. The girl stood up quietly and stepped back from the piano. "Thank you," she said softly, almost shyly. May I have something to eat now? The manager, still caught in the moment, nodded quickly. Yes, yes, of course. The old waiter smiled and guided her to a corner table. He brought her a warm bowl of soup, bread, and a cup of tea. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she wasn't sure it was real. Around her, the whispers continued. People asked who she was, where she learned to play like that, but she didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the bowl in front of her. After a while, the professional pianist came over. That piece, he said softly. Where did you learn it? I've never heard anything quite like it. She looked up at him, her eyes calm and distant. My mother taught me, she said. It was her favorite. He nodded, but she said nothing more. When she finished her meal, she thanked the waiter again and got up to leave. As she walked toward the door, several people offered her money, but she refused. I only wanted a meal, she said. That was enough. Outside, the cold air met her again, but this time something inside her felt warmer. The sound of the piano still echoed in her mind. She looked up at the night sky, took a deep breath, and smiled faintly. Inside the cafe, the customers continued talking about her. The manager kept shaking his head, still stunned by what he had witnessed. She played like she'd lived 100 lifetimes, one man said. The old waiter just smiled quietly and said, Some people carry music in their soul. You can't see it until they play. That night, long after the cafe closed, the waiter found a folded napkin left on the piano. In small, neat handwriting, it read, Thank you for the kindness. My mother always said music is only alive when someone listens. He smiled as he read it, then placed the napkin gently inside the piano's cover, like a secret memory meant to stay. For days afterward, people kept coming back to the cafe asking about the girl. No one knew her name. Some said she must be a prodigy who fell on hard times. Others thought she was a traveler passing through. But the waiter felt there was something deeper, something unspoken behind her quiet smile and sad eyes. What no one knew that night was that her story was only beginning, a story that would reveal who she truly was, and the powerful legacy hidden behind that single song. The next morning, the cafe was still buzzing with talk about the girl who had played the piano the night before. Even people who hadn't been there had already heard about her. Word spread fast in that neighborhood. Some said she was a prodigy. Others thought she was an angel sent to remind people of kindness. The truth was, no one knew who she was or where she had come from. The manager tried to act like it was no big deal, but even he couldn't stop thinking about it. The sound of her music had stayed with him all night. It wasn't just how well she played. It was the feeling behind it. It had touched something deep, something that money and status could never buy. When the cafe opened that morning, a few curious faces appeared, asking the staff if the girl would come again. The old waiter who had defended her smiled and said he didn't know. But if she does, he added softly, I hope someone offers her a seat before she has to ask for food again. The day went on as usual. The piano sat in the corner, quiet and untouched. Every time someone passed by it, they seemed to glance at it with a kind of respect, as if it now carried a secret. Late that afternoon, just as the sun began to set, the door opened again. The cold wind blew in, and standing there was the same girl. Her clothes were still the same, though her hair looked a little neater, as if she had tried to fix it before coming. She held the same torn bag in her hands. The moment the waiter saw her, he smiled warmly. You came back, he said gently. She nodded, her voice soft. I wanted to say thank you for last night. I didn't get a chance. You don't have to thank me, he replied. It was your music that did all the work. The manager came out from behind the counter, surprised to see her again. You, he said with a small grin that tried to hide his awkwardness, caused quite a stir. People are still talking about your performance. The girl looked down shyly. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Trouble? He repeated. No, you brought in more customers than we've had in a week. He chuckled a little. If you'd like to play again, you're welcome to. I can't pay you much, but I can make sure you're fed. Her eyes lifted, unsure if he was serious. Just one song? As many as you want, he said. Consider it a trade, and you play, we feed you. The offer seemed to surprise her. For a long moment she didn't move, then finally nodded. Thank you. That evening she played again. The cafe filled quickly, word spreading that the mystery girl pianist had returned. People stood by the windows just to listen. This time she played a different melody, gentle, haunting, and full of memories. Some customers closed their eyes. Others simply sat quietly, afraid to break the moment. When she finished, there was applause again, louder, longer. Someone called out, "Play another!" and she smiled faintly before beginning again. The old waiter noticed that her playing wasn't just skilled, it was emotional. Every song seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't the kind of performance that could be taught in a classroom. It was lived experience, a story told through notes. After she finished, she sat at her small corner table as before, eating quietly. The same pianist from the previous night came over again. "You really should be performing somewhere bigger than this," he told her kindly. "Have you ever studied music formally?" She shook her head. "No, I never had the chance." "Then how did you learn?" he asked. She paused for a long time before answering. "My mother," she said quietly. "She taught me before she got sick. We didn't have much, but we had an old piano that used to belong to her teacher. She said music was her only inheritance." The pianist nodded, moved by her words. "Well, you play like someone who's been touched by something special. Don't lose that." After she left that night, the cafe felt different. It wasn't just a place for food and laughter anymore. It had become a place where people came to listen, to feel something genuine. The manager decided to keep the piano open for her whenever she came. He even told the waiter to set aside a meal every evening, just in case. But the girl didn't come for several days. The waiter began to worry. He even went around the nearby streets during his break, asking if anyone had seen her. No one had. Then, one rainy afternoon, as the waiter was closing the windows against the wind, he saw her again. She was standing under the awning, soaked and shivering. Without a word, he rushed to open the door. "Come in, quickly," he said, guiding her to a seat. "You'll catch a cold out there." She sat quietly, her hands trembling from the cold. "I didn't mean to stay away," she said after a while. "I just didn't want to bother anyone." "You're no bother," he said. "This place feels empty when you're not here." The manager brought her a warm drink and said gently, "We were worried about you. Next time don't stay away so long." She smiled weakly. "I don't really have anywhere to go. Sometimes I sleep at the old train station when it's quiet." The waiter's heart sank a little hearing that. He wanted to help, but he could see how proud she was. She didn't want pity. So he said nothing more, only pushed the plate of food closer to her. That night she played again. But this time her music sounded different, softer, almost sadder. The notes carried something fragile, like she was saying goodbye through them. The cafe grew silent once more, everyone listening closely. When she finished, she stood and said softly, "Thank you for letting me play. I won't forget your kindness." The manager frowned. "What do you mean? Where are you going?" She hesitated. "Somewhere quieter. Somewhere I can think." The old waiter stood, worry in his eyes. "You can't just leave like that. At least tell us where to find you." She shook her head and smiled faintly. "It's better this way. People come and go. That's life." Before anyone could say more, she slipped out into the rain and disappeared down the street. For a long time after that night, no one saw her. The piano sat untouched again, its keys collecting dust. But the memory of her music lingered. Customers often asked about her, and each time the waiter's answer was the same. "She'll come back when the music calls her." Then one morning, nearly a week later, a letter arrived at the cafe. It was addressed simply to the kind people at the piano cafe. Inside was a small folded note written in the same neat handwriting the waiter had seen before. It read, "Thank you for letting me play. My mother always said that music finds the people who need it most. You all needed it, and so did I. I'll come back someday when I have more than a song to offer." The waiter held the note for a long time, his eyes soft. He tucked it back inside an envelope and placed it under the piano's lid, beside the napkin she'd left before. Life went on. The cafe stayed busy, but something was missing. Still, every time someone sat at that piano, they seemed to play a little differently, softer, more heartfelt, as if the spirit of that mysterious girl still lingered there. No one knew that beyond the city streets, far from the lights and the noise. The girl was sitting in a small park, playing on a public piano. Her fingers were thin and tired, but her music was stronger than ever. People stopped to listen, dropping coins into her open bag, though she never asked for any. She played not for money but for something deeper, something she couldn't yet explain. And as her song echoed through the park, an older woman passing by stopped in her tracks. She turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with disbelief. That melody, she recognized it. It was one she hadn't heard in years, written by someone she had once loved dearly. She stood there for a long time, frozen by the memory, her heart beating faster with each note. That was the moment everything began to change. The moment the truth about the girl's secret legacy started to reveal itself, one note at a time. The cold wind brushed through the park as the girl's fingers danced across the old piano keys. The sound was gentle yet powerful, carrying emotion that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those who passed by. People stopped to listen, though none of them knew who she was. To them, she was just a quiet street musician, another face in the crowd. But there was something in her music that made people stay longer than they planned. The old woman who had stopped earlier stood frozen a few steps away, her hand trembling slightly as she listened. The melody felt too familiar. It wasn't just the tune. It was the feeling, the small pauses, the way certain notes lingered. She knew this song. It was one she had helped compose many years ago, alongside a student she had loved like her own daughter. Her heart pounded as memories came rushing back. That student had been a young woman with a passion for music, a woman who used to play this exact melody before she disappeared from the stage forever. The old woman had heard rumors of her death years ago, leaving behind a little girl. When the song ended, the old woman stepped closer, her eyes filled with emotion. The girl looked up, startled. "That piece you played," the woman said softly. "Where did you learn it?" The girl hesitated, unsure whether to answer. "My mother taught me," she finally said. It was her favorite. She said it was written by her teacher when she was young. The woman's breath caught. "Your mother? What was her name?" The girl looked down, clutching the small torn bag beside her. "I'm not sure you'd remember," she said quietly. "She used to teach piano at a small music school before she got sick." "Her name was Alina," the woman gasped. Her eyes filled with tears. "Alina?" she whispered. "My dear, your mother was my student. I taught her everything I knew. She was like a daughter to me." The girl's eyes widened. She had never met anyone who had known her mother personally. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the city faded behind them. The woman finally sat beside her on the bench, her voice trembling. "I thought she was gone forever. And now here you are, playing the same song she once played for me." The girl felt her throat tighten. "She passed away years ago," she said quietly. "Before she died, she made me promise I'd keep playing no matter what. She said the world would remember her through her music." The old woman placed a hand gently on hers. "And you kept that promise." They sat together in silence for a while, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The woman studied her face carefully, the same eyes, the same quiet strength. "You look just like her," she said softly. "And you play with the same heart." The girl smiled faintly. "She used to tell me that music wasn't about showing off," she said. "It was about sharing what you feel when words aren't enough." The woman nodded slowly. She was right. And you have her gift. For the next hour they talked quietly as if time had stopped. The old woman learned about how the girl had been living on the streets, surviving day by day, carrying her mother's old music sheets in her bag. The girl had no family left, no home, and no one to turn to, but she still had her music. The woman listened with tears in her eyes. She had spent her whole life teaching music to students, but this meeting felt different. It felt like fate. Before leaving, she said gently, "Come with me. I have a small music studio not far from here. It's quiet, warm, and you can play there as much as you want. You shouldn't be sleeping outside in the cold." The girl hesitated. She had been offered help before, sometimes out of pity, sometimes with hidden intentions. But something about this woman felt different. There was warmth in her eyes, not judgment. After a long silence, she nodded. "Just for a little while," she said softly. They walked together through the narrow streets until they reached a small building tucked behind a bookstore. The woman unlocked the door and led her inside. The place smelled faintly of old wood and sheet music. Instruments lined the walls, violins, flutes, and at the center of the room a beautiful upright piano. The girl's eyes lit up. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The woman smiled. "This is where your mother used to play. She practiced here for years before she performed her first concert." The girl stepped closer and ran her fingers gently along the keys. It felt like touching a piece of her mother's past, something alive that had been waiting for her. "Play something," the woman said softly. Anything you like. The girl sat down and began to play one of her mother's old compositions. The melody filled the small room, warm and full of feeling. The woman closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was like hearing her student again after all those years. When the song ended, the girl looked up shyly. "Did I do it right?" she asked. The woman smiled through her tears. "You did it perfectly." She would have been so proud. Over the next few days, the girl stayed at the studio. The woman brought her warm meals, a blanket, and clean clothes. In return, the girl played for her every evening. The sound of her music filled the place with life again. The woman decided to contact a friend, a writer for a local newspaper, to tell him about the girl. "She's a remarkable musician," she said over the phone. "You have to hear her play." The next day, the writer came by with a photographer. The girl was nervous at first, but the woman assured her it was okay. "Your story deserves to be heard," she said gently. When the article came out, it was titled "The Street Pianist Who Carries Her Mother's Legacy." It told the story of a young homeless girl who played in a cafe for food, and how her music had moved everyone who heard it. It spoke of the teacher who had rediscovered her former student's daughter, and the bond that music had rebuilt between them. The story spread quickly. People who had been in the cafe that night recognized her photo. Some came to the studio, bringing small gifts or donations. A local music school even reached out, offering her a chance to study properly. At first, she didn't know what to say. The attention felt strange. For so long, she had been invisible, just another face people walked past on the street. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to meet her, but through it all, she stayed humble. "I don't want fame," she told the woman one night. "I just want to keep playing." "That's what my mother would have wanted." The woman nodded, proud of her. "And you will. But you also deserve a chance to live without hunger, without fear. Let the world hear your story, not because you want fame, but because it gives hope." The girl thought about that for a long moment. "Hope," she repeated softly. "That's what music really is, isn't it?" The woman smiled. "Exactly." Days turned into weeks. The girl practiced every morning, her fingers growing stronger, her confidence blooming. The woman helped her prepare for an upcoming recital at the local hall, her first public performance. On the night of the recital, the small hall was full. The same cafe manager, the old waiter, and even the pianist from before had come to see her again. When she walked on stage in a simple white dress the woman had given her, the room fell silent. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody she chose wasn't her mother's song this time. It was her own, something she had written over the past few weeks. It told her story, the hunger, the cold, the kindness of strangers, and the love that never died. By the time she played the last note, many in the audience were wiping tears from their eyes. The applause that followed was loud, but what mattered most was the feeling in the room, the connection her music had built between hearts that didn't even know her name a few months ago. Backstage, the old woman hugged her tightly. "Your mother's legacy lives on through you," she whispered. The girl smiled through tears. "Maybe," she said softly. "But tonight, I think I found my own." Outside, the night sky shimmered with stars, and the same cafe piano that had once been silent now carried her story across the city. A story born from hunger but carried by hope. And far beyond that quiet hall, her music began to travel, reaching places and people who needed to be reminded that beauty can rise from the hardest beginnings. The weeks after the recital felt like a dream. The girl could hardly believe how much her life had changed in such a short time. Just a month ago, she had been sleeping under old train benches, holding on to her mother's music sheets to keep them dry. Now she was being invited to play in front of audiences who actually wanted to hear her. Her story had spread far beyond the small town. The newspaper article had been shared on radio shows, online blogs, and even television. People were touched by the idea of a young homeless girl who played the piano for food, only to be discovered as the daughter of a once famous musician. But even as her world grew brighter, she stayed the same quiet, humble person. Every morning she went to the old studio to practice. The elderly woman who had taken her in watched her with quiet pride. The girl never complained about the long hours or the cold mornings. She practiced because it made her feel close to her mother, and because it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Sometimes, after she finished playing, She would sit by the window, looking out at the busy streets. "It feels strange," she said one evening. "People smile at me now, but they used to walk past me like I didn't exist." The old woman nodded. "People see what they want to see," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes music or kindness to make them look closer." The girl smiled faintly. "Music made them listen," she said. "But kindness saved me." As the weeks went on, more invitations began to arrive. A small concert hall in another city wanted her to perform. A music teacher offered to help her prepare for auditions at a conservatory. And one day, a letter arrived that made her heart race. It was from a foundation that supported young musicians. They wanted to sponsor her studies fully. When she read the letter aloud, the old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother would be so proud," she whispered. The girl held the letter tightly, hardly believing it was real. For so long, life had been a series of struggles. Now it felt like doors were opening faster than she could step through them. Still, she didn't let success change her. Each night after her lessons, she returned to the cafe where everything had started. The manager greeted her warmly, and the old waiter always saved her favorite table by the window. Sometimes she played a song or two just for the customers, not for attention, but because it felt right. People who had once laughed at her now listened in silence, smiling as she played. Some even apologized for how they had treated her that first night. She never held it against them. "We all have our own lessons to learn," she said gently. One evening, as she played quietly in the corner of the cafe, a man walked in and stood listening. He wore a long coat and carried a leather bag filled with papers. When she finished her song, he approached her and introduced himself as a historian who wrote books about classical musicians. "I've been following your story," he said, "but what caught my attention isn't just your talent. It's your mother's name. Do you know much about her past?" The girl shook her head. "Only what she told me," she said. "She was a pianist, but she stopped performing after my father left. She said music became too painful for her." The man nodded thoughtfully. "That's part of it," he said. "But there's more you might not know." He opened his bag and took out a worn folder. Inside were old photographs and yellowed pages of handwritten notes. "Your mother was once part of a famous orchestra," he explained. "She was known for her unique style, emotional, bold, full of color. But one night during a performance, something happened. The conductor collapsed on stage from a heart attack. Your mother was the only one who stayed to help him while everyone else panicked. After that, she left the music world completely. No one knew why." The girl listened quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "She never told me any of that," she said softly. "Maybe she didn't want to carry that pain to you," the man replied. "But her music never disappeared. Some of her compositions are still studied by musicians today. You're part of that legacy, and you carry it every time you play." The words stayed with her long after he left. That night she couldn't sleep. She opened her mother's old music sheets and studied them carefully, noticing for the first time the small marks and handwritten notes in the margins, messages her mother had left for herself. One line caught her eye. "If my daughter ever plays this, she'll understand what I meant." The girl felt tears rise in her eyes. It was like her mother had written those words for this very moment. The next morning she told the old woman everything. Together, they decided to honor her mother's memory by organizing a special performance, one that would feature her mother's original pieces, some never played in public before. The cafe owner offered his space, saying, "Your first real concert started here, so it's only right that this one begins here too." For weeks they prepared. The girl practiced day and night, carefully learning each piece the way her mother had written it. The woman helped her contact local musicians to accompany her, and soon the little cafe was transformed into a small concert hall. When the night of the performance arrived, the place was packed. People crowded outside the windows just to listen. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. As the girl walked to the piano, she paused for a moment and looked around. She saw the manager standing proudly near the counter, the old waiter smiling beside him, the woman who had saved her watching from the front row, and even the historian sitting quietly with his notebook. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first song was one her mother had composed in her youth, soft and full of hope. The second was written after her father left, heavy with sadness but still beautiful. The third was unfinished. She had completed it herself, using the small notes her mother had left behind. Every note seemed to fill the room with warmth. People listened silently, some holding hands, others closing their eyes. It wasn't just music. It was a story being told without words. By the time she finished the last piece, tears were flowing freely through the crowd. The applause that followed shook the walls. Some people stood on their chairs, clapping and cheering. The girl bowed her head, tears in her own eyes. She could almost feel her mother there, sitting beside her at the piano, smiling. After the concert, the old woman hugged her tightly. "You didn't just play her music," she whispered. "You brought her back to life tonight." The cafe manager wiped his eyes and said with a grin, "From now on, this piano belongs to you." But she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It belongs to everyone who listens." That night, after everyone left, she sat alone at the piano for a while. The cafe was quiet and the candles had burned low. She pressed a few soft notes, not for anyone else, but for herself, a private song of gratitude. She looked around the room that had once been filled with laughter and doubt, the same place where she had once been turned away, hungry and cold. Now it was filled with warmth and love. Her heart felt light. She wasn't just the girl who played for a meal anymore. She was a musician with a purpose, a daughter who had fulfilled her mother's promise, and a person who had turned pain into something beautiful. As she walked out into the night, the stars shimmered above her. The city that had once ignored her now seemed to hum with quiet admiration. Somewhere deep in her soul she could still hear her mother's voice, calm, proud, and full of love. And though she didn't know what her future would hold, she felt ready for it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She had music, she had hope, and she had people who believed in her. Her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. A journey not of survival anymore, but of purpose. After that night in the cafe, everything seemed to change again, but this time it wasn't sudden or overwhelming. It was gentle, like the way dawn slowly replaces darkness. The girl began to receive letters from people across the country. Some wrote to thank her for reminding them that hope could come from anywhere. Others sent stories of their own, about dreams they'd lost and wanted to find again. She tried to read every letter, though it often brought tears to her eyes. Each one felt like a small echo of her mother's music, people connecting, healing, remembering. Then one morning, while she was sweeping the floor of the cafe after her practice, the old woman walked in holding a newspaper. "You might want to sit down before you read this," she said softly, handing it to her. On the front page was a picture of her sitting at the piano, her head slightly bowed. The headline read, "The Homeless Pianist Who Revived a Forgotten Legacy." The article told her story, from the night she asked to play for a meal to her mother's lost compositions that had now touched thousands of hearts. But what caught her attention most was a name mentioned near the end. It said a famous orchestra conductor wanted to meet her, claiming he knew something about her family's past. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she read. "He knew my family," she whispered. The old woman smiled gently. "Maybe it's time to learn the rest of your story," she said. A few days later, a car came to pick her up. She wore a simple white dress the woman had sewn for her, and carried her mother's music folder under her arm. The drive took her to a large music hall in the city, a place filled with posters of great musicians and golden lights that reflected off the polished floors. When she entered the rehearsal room, the conductor stood waiting. He was tall, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to have seen both beauty and sorrow. As soon as he saw her, he smiled warmly. "You have your mother's hands," he said. She hesitated. "You knew her?" He nodded. "Yes, many years ago I was her student," he said. "Your mother was one of the most gifted pianists I ever met. She used to say music was not meant to impress. It was meant to heal. I never forgot that." The girl felt a lump rise in her throat. "She never told me much about those days," she said softly. "Only that she stopped playing," the man sighed. "She stopped because of heartbreak, not just from losing your father, but from what came after. You see, when she left the orchestra, she was offered a contract that could have made her world famous. But she refused it because she wanted to stay home and raise you. Her dream wasn't fame anymore, it was you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never knew," she whispered. The conductor nodded slowly. "I think she wanted you to find music on your own terms. And you did." He paused, then added gently, "We're organizing a tribute concert next month. a performance to honor forgotten musicians. I would be honored if you played your mother's final piece. The girl was silent for a long moment. I'd love to, she said finally, her voice trembling. For the next few weeks, she practiced day and night, this time not in the cafe but in a grand rehearsal hall. Yet despite the size and echo of the space, she never lost her humility. Every note she played came from the same place, the heart of a girl who once asked for food, not fame. The old woman often came to sit quietly during rehearsals, knitting in the corner. Sometimes she smiled and whispered, "Your mother must be proud of how far you've come." But as the concert drew closer, something unexpected happened. A journalist from a national channel came to interview her. During the conversation, he showed her a photograph, an old, faded image of a young man standing beside her mother at a piano. "This picture was found in an old archive," he said. "The man in it is your grandfather, a composer who disappeared years ago after a family dispute. He was thought to have left music forever. But there are rumors he's still alive, living quietly in the countryside." The girl stared at the picture, shocked. "My grandfather?" she whispered. "I thought my mother was an orphan." "That's what everyone thought," the journalist replied. "But it seems she chose to hide that part of her life. Maybe to protect you." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about all the secrets her mother had carried. The pain, the love, the sacrifices. It made her realize something important. Her mother's silence hadn't been emptiness. It had been strength. The next day, she asked the journalist for the address where her grandfather might be living. He hesitated but finally agreed. "He's an old man now," he said, "but maybe he deserves to hear your music." So, on a misty morning, she set off with the old woman by her side. The journey took hours, through long roads, fields, and small villages. Finally, they arrived at a small wooden house surrounded by tall trees. When she knocked, an elderly man opened the door. His eyes were tired but kind. The moment he saw the folder of music in her hands, he froze. "That handwriting," he whispered. "Where did you get it?" "It's my mother's," she said quietly. "She was your daughter." The old man's lips trembled. He leaned against the door frame, tears filling his eyes. "I thought I'd lost her forever," he said. They sat inside by the fireplace, and she told him everything. How her mother had raised her alone, how they'd struggled, how she had found her way back to music through the same songs he had taught his daughter long ago. When she finished, the old man wiped his eyes and said softly, "I left the world of music because of pride. I thought my daughter betrayed me when she left my orchestra, but she didn't. She just wanted to live her own melody." He reached out and touched her hand. "And now you're carrying it forward." Before they left, he opened an old wooden chest and pulled out a worn book of music. "These were her first lessons," he said. "I wrote them for her when she was your age. They belong to you now." The girl accepted the book with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. When she returned to the city, she brought those forgotten pieces with her, a missing part of her mother's story. She practiced them every day until she knew them by heart. Finally, the night of the tribute concert arrived. The hall was filled with people, musicians, teachers, students, and reporters. Cameras flashed as she walked on stage, but she barely noticed. In her heart, she was thinking only of the two people who had given her everything, her mother and the kind woman who had helped her believe again. As she sat down at the piano, the conductor gave her a nod. The lights dimmed and silence fell across the hall. Then slowly, she began to play. The first song was one her mother had written as a child, light, innocent, full of joy. The second came from the book her grandfather had given her, tender, filled with love and forgiveness. And the last was her own, a melody that blended both of their worlds together. It was as if 3 generations were speaking through her hands, her grandfather's wisdom, her mother's passion, and her own heart. When the final note faded, there was no sound for a few seconds, just stillness. Then the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, crying, shouting her name. The conductor wiped a tear from his eye and said quietly, "Your mother's legacy lives on, not just in music, but in you." After the performance, she walked outside into the cool night air. Reporters crowded around her, asking about fame, fortune, future plans. But she only smiled and said softly, "All I ever wanted was to play for a meal. Everything else is just grace." The next morning, the newspapers carried her story again, this time with a new headline, The girl who played for a meal now plays for the world. Her music had reached beyond borders. People from different countries began sharing her performance online. Music schools requested copies of her mother's pieces to teach their students. The cafe where it had all begun became a small local landmark. People came from far away just to sit at the piano she had once played for food. Yet through it all, she remained humble. She continued visiting the cafe, sometimes sitting quietly in the corner listening to young musicians play. And every time she saw a struggling artist or a hungry soul, she smiled and said, "Would you like to play for a meal?" Because she remembered what it felt like to be unseen, and how one moment of kindness had changed everything. Her story was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy, not the kind written in books or recorded on screens, but the kind carried in hearts. The music, the love, the hope. They all lived on. And as she looked out at the sunset that evening, her fingers gently resting on the piano keys, she whispered a quiet promise to the sky. "For you, Mama," she said, "for all of us." Months passed after the tribute concert, but the memory of that night stayed fresh in everyone's hearts. The world had begun to see her not just as a girl with a sad story, but as an artist with a soul that could make even silence beautiful. Everywhere she went, people treated her with respect and warmth. But fame was never what she wanted. She always said quietly, "Music is not about being seen. It's about helping others feel something real." She still lived a simple life in the small apartment above the cafe. Every morning she practiced on the same old piano, its wooden keys now smooth from years of use. The cafe owner had kept his promise. He never sold it, never moved it. It had become a symbol of hope for everyone who came there. The old woman who had taken her in when she was at her lowest often sat by her side as she practiced. Sometimes they shared tea and talked about little things, not fame, not money, just life. "You know," the woman said one morning, smiling softly, "your music has made this cafe the happiest place in town." The girl laughed gently. "Maybe it's not the music," she said. "Maybe it's the kindness that lives here." As her story spread, people from around the world began to write to her. Some sent gifts, others sent letters telling her how her music had changed their lives. There were parents who said their children started learning piano after watching her. There were people who had lost loved ones and said her songs helped them find peace again. She read each letter slowly, often crying quietly afterward. "I wish my mother could see this," she said one evening. "She always believed music could heal people. I understand it now." One day, the conductor who had helped her with the tribute concert visited her again. He looked proud but a little nervous. "I have some news," he said. "A film director wants to make a documentary about your life, from the streets to the stage. He wants you to tell your story in your own words." She hesitated. "I'm not sure I want cameras following me," she said softly. The conductor smiled. "It's not about cameras. It's about legacy, the kind your mother left you. There are still children out there who think they'll never be seen or heard. Maybe your story can give them hope." The words touched her heart. She thought about all the nights she had been hungry and cold, about the strangers who had walked past her, and about the one kind woman who stopped and gave her a chance. If telling her story could remind people that kindness mattered, then maybe it was worth it, so she agreed. The filming began quietly. No big lights or scripts, just her sitting at the piano, talking softly about her journey. She told them how she had played for a meal, how people had laughed, and how one moment of compassion had changed everything. The director didn't interrupt or stage anything. He just let her speak and play. Sometimes she stopped mid-sentence, looking lost in thought, and then began playing a soft melody. Some things, she said, can only be said through music. When the film was finally released, it spread like wildfire. People cried watching her story. They said it reminded them that behind every stranger on the street, there might be a story worth listening to soon. Donations began pouring in to help homeless musicians, single mothers, and children who couldn't afford music lessons. A foundation was even started in her name with her full permission, not for fame, but to give others what she had once needed, a chance. Despite all the attention, she stayed the same. She still walked through the market with her small bag of groceries, still stopped to talk to street musicians, and still returned to the cafe most evenings to play. But one evening, something unexpected happened. It was late. The cafe was almost empty. She was softly playing a tune when the door opened and a man walked in slowly. He looked old, tired and uncertain, his clothes worn, his hands trembling slightly. The cafe owner glanced up but said nothing, letting the man find his way to the piano. The girl looked up and offered a gentle smile. "Would you like to sit?" she asked kindly. The man nodded and sat across from her. He listened quietly for a few moments, then whispered, "That melody. I used to hear it when I was young. My wife played it." The girl's hands froze over the keys. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded again. "She was a pianist. She left me when our daughter was little. I tried to find them for years but failed. I've been living alone since." The girl's breath caught in her chest. Her heart began to race. "Your wife's name?" she whispered. "What was it?" He said the name, the one she hadn't heard spoken aloud by anyone but herself and her mother. Tears filled her eyes. The cafe went silent. The old woman who had been clearing tables nearby turned around slowly, realizing what was happening. The man looked confused as he watched her reaction. "Why do you look at me that way?" he asked, his voice trembling. She stood up slowly, her hands shaking. "Because," she said softly, "she was my mother." The man's eyes widened. For a moment he didn't move. Then his hands covered his mouth as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "My daughter," he whispered. The cafe owner quietly stepped back, letting the two of them have the space. The girl nodded, tears falling freely now. "She told me you left," she said, her voice breaking. "She said music became too painful after that." The man's shoulders slumped. "I never left because I stopped loving her," he said quietly. "We argued about life, about the future. I thought she wanted to forget me, so I stayed away. I didn't know. I didn't know she had you." They stood there for a long moment, both shaking, both crying. Then he reached out and she stepped into his arms. For the first time in her life, she felt the warmth of a father she had never known. The old woman wiped her eyes silently from the corner. Even the cafe owner, a man who rarely showed emotion, stood still with tears in his eyes. When they finally sat down, the girl brought out her mother's old music sheets, the same ones she had carried through years of struggle. "These were hers," she said softly. "I've kept them safe." The man ran his fingers over the pages, recognizing his wife's handwriting. He smiled sadly. "She always wrote notes in the margins," he said. "Look, she even wrote your name here." The girl looked at the small note scribbled beside one of the songs. It said, "For my little one, may she find her own melody someday." They sat together for hours that night, sharing stories, memories of her mother, her childhood, the life they both had lost but somehow found again. After that, her father became a quiet part of her world. He didn't seek attention or fame. He only wanted to spend whatever years he had left making up for lost time. Sometimes he came to the cafe and listened as she played. Sometimes he sat beside her and turned the pages of music, smiling like a man who had finally come home. One evening, during a charity concert arranged by her foundation, she introduced him to the audience. "This," she said softly, "is the last piece of my story, the one I never thought I'd find. Music didn't just give me food or a future, it gave me family." As she played that night, her father sat in the front row, eyes closed, listening to the daughter he never knew he had. The notes floated through the hall, gentle, full, alive, carrying with them every pain, every hope, every second chance that life had given them. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet, clapping wildly. But she didn't look at them. She looked only at her father, who smiled with tears in his eyes. After the concert, as they walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, she looked up at the sky and whispered quietly, "I think she would be happy now." Her father nodded. "She is," he said softly. "Every time you play, she's right there." And for the first time, she truly believed it. From a hungry girl who once begged to play for a meal to a woman whose music brought people together, her journey had come full circle. She had found kindness, love, and belonging, not in grand places, but in the simplest corners of the world. And as she sat at the piano one last time that night, her fingers dancing softly over the keys, she smiled. Because now she wasn't just playing to survive, she was playing to live.